It's December 6th, 1917. You're standing at the window of your home in Richmond, the working class neighborhood on the north end of Halifax, Nova Scotia. Outside, the harbor is alive with movement: tugboats, merchant vessels, warships. The Great War is 3 years old, and this port has become one of the busiest in the world. You watch your children press their faces to the glass. Something is happening out on the Narrows. Two ships are drifting toward each other. There is a collision and then a fire. Black smoke pours from one of the vessels. You don't know it yet, but you have approximately 6 minutes to live. What is about to happen will be the largest man-made explosion in history, a record that will stand until the atomic age. It will kill nearly 2,000 people, injure 9,000 more, and flatten an entire district of a city in a single, blinding instant. Halifax, by 1917, was a city transformed by conflict. Its deep, ice-free harbor made it one of the most strategically important ports in the British Empire. Convoys of ships gathered here before making the perilous Atlantic crossing to supply the war effort in Europe. The harbor teemed with naval vessels, troop transports, and cargo ships laden with food, fuel, and munitions. The Richmond district sat right along the water's edge, a dense neighborhood of wooden homes, shops, churches, and schools. Families of dock workers, sailors, and factory laborers lived in its narrow streets. Children walked to school along roads that overlooked the harbor. The proximity to the water was not just geography, it was identity. That proximity was also a vulnerability no one fully appreciated. The Narrows, the slim channel connecting the inner Bedford Basin to the outer harbor, was a bottleneck through which all traffic had to pass. Two-way traffic in a channel barely wide enough for it. An accident here was not a question of if, but when. On that December morning, a French cargo ship called the Mont-Blanc was entering the Narrows from the outer harbor. She was not a remarkable vessel, a modest freighter, aging, slow, but her cargo was extraordinary. She carried 2,300 tons of wet and dry picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 35 tons of high-octane benzol fuel, and 10 tons of gun cotton. She was, in essence, a floating bomb. Coming the other direction, outbound through the Narrows, was the Imo, a Norwegian relief vessel headed for New York to pick up supplies for war-ravaged Belgium. The Imo had been delayed overnight, and her captain was impatient to make up time. She was moving faster than she should have been through the narrow channel. The rules of navigation in the Narrows required ships to keep to the right, the maritime equivalent of driving on the correct side of the road. But on this morning, a series of small navigational decisions and miscommunications put the two vessels on a collision course. Neither captain could have understood what those small errors would cost. At approximately 8:45 a.m., the Imo's bow struck the Mont Blanc on her starboard side. The impact itself was relatively minor, a glancing blow at low speed. But the collision ruptured barrels of benzol stored on the Mont Blanc's deck, and as the Imo's hull scraped against the French ship's steel plating, sparks ignited the spilling fuel. Fire erupted aboard the Mont Blanc. The crew, who knew exactly what was in their hold, understood with immediate and absolute clarity what was about to happen. Captain Aimé Lemedec ordered his men to abandon ship. They did not stay to fight the fire. They did not signal the shore. They rowed for the Dartmouth side of the harbor as fast as they could. Critics would later condemn the crew for not warning the city, but historians have noted that the Mont Blanc carried no red munitions flag. Wartime regulations actually prohibited it to avoid alerting enemy submarines to the nature of the cargo. The people on shore had no way of knowing what burned aboard that ship. The burning Mont Blanc drifted toward Pier 6 in the Richmond district. From the shore, the fire was spectacular. Towering flames, plumes of thick black and white smoke, barrels of benzol exploding like fireworks. People came to their windows. They stepped out onto porches. Children lined the waterfront. In the rail yard near the harbor, dispatcher Vincent Coleman received a frantic warning from a sailor. The ship was loaded with munitions. Coleman could have run. Instead, he stayed at his telegraph key and sent a message up and down the rail line. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor, making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. Then he waited. Across the harbor, sailors aboard the HMS Highflyer scrambled to organize a firefighting party. A crew from the tugboat Stella Maris, under Captain Horatio Brannan, attached a tow line to the Mont Blanc to try to pull her away from the pier. They were still working when time ran out. At 9 hours, 4 minutes, and 35 seconds a.m., the fire reached the Mont Blanc's cargo. The explosion was instantaneous and nearly incomprehensible in its violence. The blast released an estimated force equivalent to 2.9 kilotons of TNT, roughly a seventh of the Hiroshima bomb. The Mont Blanc was annihilated. Her hull was vaporized. A half-ton fragment of her anchor shaft landed over 2 miles away. A white fireball surged upward into a mushroom cloud that rose more than 12,000 feet. The pressure wave radiated outward at supersonic speed, shattering every structure within a half-mile radius. Buildings did not simply collapse, they disintegrated. Wooden homes became lethal clouds of shrapnel. Stoves overturned. Fires ignited across the ruins. The blast was felt over 200 miles away. In Truro, 60 miles distant, windows shattered. In Cape Breton, people thought there had been an earthquake. In the Richmond district itself, entire blocks simply ceased to exist. Nearly 1,600 people were killed instantly or died within minutes. The explosion displaced the water beneath it, exposing the harbor floor for a brief, surreal moment. Then the sea rushed back. A tsunami wave rose over 60 feet above the normal high water mark in parts of the harbor, surging inland and dragging wreckage, debris, and bodies back into the water. On the Mi'kmaq community of Turtle Grove, across the harbor in Dartmouth, the waves struck with devastating force. The small settlement was largely destroyed. Members of the community who survived were forced into relief camps. Their losses were, for decades, largely unacknowledged in official accounts of the disaster. Then came a second catastrophe. Thousands of people had been standing at windows when the blast wave hit. The shattering glass blinded hundreds. The Halifax Explosion produced one of the worst mass blinding events in modern history. Surgeons in the overwhelmed hospitals would spend days removing glass fragments from eyes that could not be saved. Within minutes, fires began spreading through the shattered remains of Richmond. Ruptured gas lines fed the flames. People trapped beneath collapsed buildings heard the fire approaching. Rescue workers, soldiers, sailors, ordinary citizens worked desperately to pull survivors free before the flames reached them. Not all were reached in time. The city's hospitals were themselves damaged. Camp Hill Hospital, the nearest major facility, had windows blown out and walls cracked. Doctors and nurses operated in freezing conditions with inadequate supplies. Bodies were laid in rows outside. The injured kept arriving, by cart, by car, carried in the arms of strangers. And then, as if the city hadn't endured enough, the weather turned. The next day, December 7th, a blizzard struck Halifax, dumping over 16 inches of snow on the ruins, Temperatures plunged. Rescue operations ground to a near halt. Survivors huddled in schools, churches, and open fields, many without coats, many bleeding, many not knowing if their families were alive. Vincent Coleman's final telegraph message had reached the outside world. Word of the disaster spread rapidly. And the first major response came not from within Canada, but from the city of Boston, Massachusetts. Governor Samuel McCall organized a relief train within hours, loaded with doctors, nurses, medical supplies, glass, and building materials. The train pushed through the blizzard, arriving in Halifax on December 8th. Boston's response was extraordinary, swift, generous, and sustained. Surgeons from Massachusetts performed hundreds of operations. Supplies poured in. The relationship between the two cities was permanently transformed by this act of solidarity. To this day, every December, the province of Nova Scotia sends a giant Christmas tree to the city of Boston. It is placed on Boston Common and lit in a public ceremony, a tradition that has continued since 1971. A living thank you for the help that arrived when Halifax was at its most desperate. The final toll was staggering. Approximately 1,782 people were confirmed dead, though the true number may be higher. Some victims were never identified, and entire families were erased without anyone left to report them missing. Over 9,000 were injured. More than 1,600 buildings were destroyed and 12,000 damaged. Roughly 6,000 people were left homeless. The dead included hundreds of children. Entire classrooms had been wiped out. The Protestant orphanage in the blast zone was destroyed. Accounts differ on the number of children who perished inside, but the loss was profound. Schools had been in session. The explosion had struck on a Thursday morning. Among the dead were firefighters, soldiers, and sailors who had rushed toward the burning ship rather than away from it. The crew of the Stella Maris, who had been trying to tow the Mont Blanc away from the pier, were killed almost to a man. Their captain, Horatio Brannan, survived with severe injuries. In the aftermath, a formal inquiry was launched. The Mont Blanc's captain, Aimée Lemedec, and her pilot, Francis Mackey, were arrested and charged with manslaughter. Public anger demanded someone be held responsible. The inquiry initially blamed the Mont Blanc, and a judge recommended charges against Lemedec and Mackey. But the Canadian Supreme Court later overturned the finding, ruling that both ships bore equal responsibility for the collision. The manslaughter charges were dropped. Historians have since debated whether the IMO's speed and positioning bore greater fault. No one was ever convicted. The disaster, it seemed, belonged to everyone and no one. The explosion also prompted sweeping changes to maritime safety regulations worldwide. Rules governing the transport and handling of munitions through populated harbors were rewritten. The disaster became a foundational case study in the management of hazardous materials. Lessons learned, as is so often the case, at an unbearable cost. Halifax rebuilt. The Richmond district was redesigned by Thomas Adams, a British urban planner, into one of Canada's first planned communities. The Hydrostone neighborhood, named for the durable concrete blocks used in its construction. The streets were wider, the houses were sturdier, but the neighborhood was different. The old Richmond, with its close-knit organic character, was gone forever. For decades, survivors carried the scars, physical and psychological. The mass blinding of hundreds of Halifax residents led to significant advances in Canadian ophthalmology and rehabilitation services. The Canadian National Institute for the Blind expanded its programs, partly in response to the explosion's victims. Suffering, as it sometimes does, catalyzed progress. Today, a memorial bell tower stands in Fort Needham Memorial Park, on the hill overlooking the site where the Richmond district once stood. Every December 6th, a ceremony is held. The bell rings at 9:04 a.m. The names of the dead are read aloud. The city remembers. The Halifax explosion was not an act of war. It was not sabotage. It was the consequence of haste, miscommunication, and the terrifying proximity between ordinary life and extraordinary destructive power. It reminds us that catastrophe does not always announce itself, that sometimes it arrives on an unremarkable Thursday morning, on a ship no one thought to fear, in a harbor everyone thought they knew,